Let me ask you first, Carl Bildt. You have seen what's going on. I don't know how much of President Trump's final press conference you listened to. It went on for quite a long time. But talk to me about the unity and the love, he said, was expressed in that room. What do you think?
I think love is a rather wild exaggeration. I mean, we should start from the basics, and that is that the level of trust among the Europeans in President Trump is very low. So when you go into a summit of this sort, the aim is to survive the summit without any major bust-up or any major crisis. From that point of view, it succeeded in Ankara. There was no major bust-up. It was, of course, Trump, which was highly unfortunate, repeating the claims on Greenland, and he was threatening economic warfare on Spain and a couple of other things. But I understand that in the internal deliberations, he was mainly speaking about Iran, and of course his misgivings with the lack of support from the Europeans, but he didn't question NATO in the way that he has done before. And that, if one should be positive, that was, of course, the positive thing.
And kind of a victory, really, because, yes, positive, but also a bit of a victory for the alliance and for the idea of, you know, still having a U.S. shield. Would you say that NATO, Carl, you know, Europe could feel confident still that America will be there to support them?
I don't think it changed very much in that particular respect. I mean, we have very low standards these days. So the fact that a meeting has happened without a major crisis is now seen as a success, and even, as you say, a victory. But what is still pending is, of course, the big question about the American commitment to Europe. They have announced that they will do a review of the American military presence, contributions to NATO, contribution to the defense of Europe. But that's going to happen, or that's going to be out in a couple of months' time. That's, of course, critical. What we are aiming for, well, developing into is, of course, a NATO with significantly less US. The question is, how much will the US commitment to the security of Europe be reduced? And in what shape and form will that process happen? Are we more confident in American support these days? President Trump is fairly unpredictable, to put it in those terms.
All right, let me ask Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. Where do you think NATO sort of landed today? And same sort of question to you: is Trump indicating, you know, a continued, you know, being a vigorous member of the alliance, or what? Because, as Carl said, he did threaten Greenland again. The Prime Minister of Denmark even said in the same room that Denmark would defend every inch of NATO territory, obviously including Greenland, sitting with the President of the United States. It must have been pretty awkward.
Yeah, it was pretty awkward. I mean, I think two things came out of this meeting. Number one, I think an agreement not to have them anymore. It was noteworthy that the leaders said that they were looking forward to seeing each other at a future meeting, but weren't defining that future meeting as they had in the past as being in 2027 in Albania. So they have now concluded that, frankly, 2 days of coming together with the hope and the victory that you're seeking being a boring meeting, as the Lithuanian foreign minister put it, is really not worth it. And so I don't think they're going to have a summit again until after President Trump leaves office. But secondly, and I think this is important, the president, although he, as you rightly said, he went after Greenland again, he went after Spain, he castigated allies in a whole variety of ways, he didn't call into question America's membership of NATO. And indeed, he signed on to a statement that the commitment to Article 5, the idea of an attack against one being an attack against all, that commitment was, quote, ironclad. He did talk about the fact that the meeting itself had shown a tremendous degree of unity. And by all accounts, his behavior inside the meeting was genial and even supportive of what the Europeans were doing. So I think the day where you were worried that the United States was actually walking away from NATO, that day is over. So then the question fundamentally becomes, what's the relative balance of contributions? that the United States and its European and Canadian allies are going to make to the defense of Europe. And that balance is shifting very sharply away from a dominant United States that has contributed at times 70% of the forces and 90% or even more of certain capabilities. The Europeans are going to take on a greater role. The question is this going to happen cooperatively with the United States, or is it going to be because the United States said we're going to withdraw our capabilities because we need them elsewhere? That is to be sorted out.
And I'm actually fascinated by the idea that there won't maybe be another meeting until the end of the Trump term, because you've probably all read this report in the Wall Street Journal, a very deeply reported article talking about, the crisis talks amongst European leaders and how to face Trump. And one of the conclusions, obviously, was what Prime Minister Carney had said, which is there is no going back. We're not going to be able to go back to the, good old days of NATO pre-Trump. But there also seems to be two competing strategies. The Mark Rutte strategy, which is keeping Trump, keeping the United States entirely on board, and the Macron argument that Europe must prepare for greater independence. Ivo, which one do you think is going to win, or are they just going to wait and hope that something changes when Trump is no longer president?
So I think you need to do both. And I think there's a role for Mark Rutte in trying to keep the United States on side by the flattery that he is better at than virtually anyone else. And in that sense, the fact that the summit, one, happened and two, didn't fall apart is in large measure a testament to, one, where it was held, which is in Turkey, but secondly, to Mark Rutte's leadership in trying to keep the United States engaged. And though I don't like it, I don't think anybody likes it, I'm pretty sure Mark Rutte doesn't like it, it is effective to that extent. But at the same time, you also need the Macron or Carney or whomever strategy that says, listen, we cannot depend on the United States. The United States is no longer a reliable ally. And as a result, we need to do more by ourselves and for ourselves in case, in fact, the United States decides that in a particular situation, it no longer wants to participate in NATO operations. And so you need to do both. Because you might have a NATO that is more European, but you don't want to have a NATO that doesn't have the United States engaged. After all, the U.S., in my view, and I think the view of vast majority of Americans is European security is still indivisible from American security and vice versa.
So, Carl, as the European, do you feel that America in general does believe that they're still intertwined? But also pick up on what Ivo said about how the actual location of the summit this week was in Turkey. Why do you agree that was, aided the sort of, the atmospherics and the unity that came out of it? Obviously, Trump likes Erdogan. He says it over and again.
Well, he said himself that a couple of weeks ago, he said that he was really not intending to go to the NATO summit because he thought it was useless. But he wanted to go because of President Erdogan. So from that point of view, the fact that it was in Ankara was significant. Trump did come. And although there were the hiccups, to put it mildly, on Greenland and Spain and a couple of others, as Ivo said, the organization survived. And there's a short communique that is fairly constructive and fairly good. But we shouldn't disguise the fact that there is a disconnect in the biggest issue that we are facing, and that is the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which Europeans see as fundamental to our security. And Trump said something that Ukraine is far away. I mean, Iran is even more further away, by the way, but he indicated that they don't really have a dog in that particular fight. And that has, of course, been the problem. That Europeans see that when we have an acute threat to the security of Europe, the Americans or Trump has been backing away in a way that leads to sort of worries of what might happen if Putin escalates into something else. That's the big uncertainty that is there.
Well, let me just build on that, because I want to ask you both about, obviously, the big threat, the hugest threat for NATO, which is Russia and the invasion of Ukraine and the war on Europe, threatening NATO. I was actually surprised, although nothing should surprise us about Donald Trump, that instead of the beat down and the berating that he gave Zelensky back in the White House that famous time, he was actually much more congenial. He had that meeting on the sidelines with President Zelensky. And then he said that he was thinking about, or he would allow the Ukrainians to build Patriot missiles, allow them the license, and allow other Europeans, NATO members, to do the same. And that he apparently also said that as soon as this was over, he was going to go and talk to Putin, call Putin, and talk about how to try to get to a ceasefire. And he thought that the Zelensky, the Ukrainian, the way they're taking the war to Russia now, especially Crimea, could prod, Putin into some other calculation. What do you make of that, Carl?
Well, there's no question that there has been an improvement in the sort of personal chemistry between Zelensky and Trump since the famous meetings in the Oval Office. At that time, I think the perception or the belief of J.D. Vance notably said it all the time, Ukraine was on the verge of losing. And they were more or less on the Russian side when it comes to how that should be the conclusion of the war. Now, they do understand that that is not what is happening on the battlefield. The front is fairly stable. The Russian attempts at offensive operations have largely failed. And even if the Ukrainians are receiving quite heavy damage from the Russian missiles, they have brought the war home to the Russians as well. So the dynamics of the conflict have changed. And that, I think, has influenced the White House and Trump. Whether that will translate into a change in the diplomatic approach, that has been, in my opinion, misdirected and confused ever since Anchorage, that remains to be seen. But clearly the Europeans would like the Americans, or Trump particularly, to be somewhat more constructive and less accommodating to Putin on these issues.
Ivo, as the former US ambassador to NATO, pick up on that, because you have recently written in Politico about what appears to be still, even under this administration, the same kind of fear under the Biden administration of how Putin might escalate and react to more help and more squeeze on him, more help to the Ukrainians. You wrote recently about Trump's decision not to sell Tomahawk missiles to Germany. Quote, not only is Washington no longer deploying deep precision strike systems to Europe, it's also denying its European allies the capacity to arm themselves with these systems out of fear of Russia's reaction. And today the Latvian president said NATO needs to take a stronger posture. If we say that there is going to be an attack, then we also need to say that we will fight. That's the Latvian president about this whole issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought, what was interesting by President Trump is that he also supported the deep strikes by Ukrainians against Russia. And indeed, those strikes, by the way, couldn't happen but for the fact that the United States is providing significant intelligence, by some sources that I talked to, more significant intelligence than was provided during the Biden administration, in order to allow these strikes to happen. There's a difference, however, in allowing and working with the Ukrainians to allow Ukrainian drones and capabilities to hit Russians and U.S. systems. At least that's the line that the Biden administration drew. And I think it is the line in some ways that the Trump administration is drawing, not only with regard to Ukraine, but importantly with regard to our allies, particularly when it comes to selling Tomahawk long-range ground-launched missiles to Germany. And I worry about the fact that the U.S. is trying to, in some ways, decouple its security from that of Europe. That is very much what I think this administration, particularly this Pentagon, is bent on doing. And I think that is a big mistake. I think this is a time when the pressure on Russia should be increased. As Carl rightly said, the situation is changing. And, Trump likes to back winners. He doesn't like to back losers. And right now it seems like Zelensky and Ukraine are the winners and Putin and Russia are the losers. Let's continue that pressure on Russia, therefore, in order to get to a end of this conflict that is consistent with Ukrainian security interests and therefore ours.
And Carl, last word then. Do you think this, pressure by Trump on Europe is actually working to do what Ivo says, to actually like that amp up the pressure on Putin. I spoke to the former British Prime Minister Theresa May today, and she was the first world leader to meet with Trump, as she told me, precisely to keep him attached to NATO. This is what she told me.
I was the first world leader to visit President Trump in his first term, and one of the reasons for doing that was to ensure that he would support NATO. And he did, and he came out supporting NATO. But what he said at NATO was what the UK actually agreed with, which was that the countries sitting around that NATO table had to up their defence spending.
Carl, we can't ignore the fact that actually Britain still needs to up its defence spending. As we've seen, there's been a crisis in the British government because of this. But do you credit Trump with actually doing what many of you have believed should be done, and that is more contribution from NATO members?
Well, I would credit, if that is the word that should be used, Vladimir Putin primarily for that. I mean, the fact that we are, for example, Sweden, my own country, we are tripling defense spending in some years. That's quite a lot of money. We are not doing that because some orders coming out of the White House. We are doing it because a country that is fairly close to us, Russia, is launching a huge military aggression in the middle of Europe. We would never have been able to get public opinion support for the vast increases in defense spending that we see in Sweden, in Norway, in Germany, and X numbers of other countries, only because of American recommendations or pressure. It is the actual situation that we face in our reality of European security that is causing this. Then the Americans and Trump, the Americans have been saying for a long time that we are underspending. They've been right in that, no question about that, during X numbers of administrations. At the same time, the Americans have also been taking down defense spending and taking down their commitment to Europe during this particular period. So we've both been having that sort of misdirection of policies for a long time. Now it's changing, and that's good. But where the disappointment with Trump is, of course, the fact that he's backed away from supporting Ukraine.
Well, yeah, well, we'll see, because he seems to be saying the right stuff now. We'll see where that goes. Former Prime Minister Carl Bildt, former Ambassador to NATO Ivo Daalder, thank you very much indeed.